Well, my name is Gwendolyn Cartledge. I'm a professor here at the university, Ohio State University, and my area happens to be special education with an emphasis on children with learning and behavior disorders. I have, in the past, I'd say 20 years, have really, within the past, I'd say 5 to 6 years, I've not only looked at children with behavior disorders, but looked at youngsters in terms of preventing learning and behavior disorders, and particularly focused on these youngsters in urban settings, and youngsters who come from culturally diverse backgrounds, and youngsters who we consider to be at most at risk, and that happens to be minority males. So that's an area of focus for me. I am, as I said, a professor here at Ohio State, and I've been here since 1986. Prior to that, I was on the faculty at Cleveland State. And prior to that, I did my graduate work. Actually, I got my doctorate here at Ohio State. Did my undergraduate and master's work at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was born and reared in southwestern Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. And so how did I get here? Well, as I often say, I've always wanted to be a teacher. From my earliest memories, I've always wanted to be a teacher. And my mother used to say that I was a natural born teacher, and she drew those conclusions from watching me teach Sunday school, where she was the superintendent. And she just felt that I was meant to be a teacher. Well, at any rate, I followed that passion and did my undergraduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was certified to teach children in general education, or elementary school children without disabilities. And I did that actually in my hometown for about 2 years. But at the same time, I was working on my master's degree. And the entire time that I wanted to be a teacher, I wanted to focus on children with the greatest need. And a turning point for me when I was working at the elementary school was to observe two children in particular that had obvious emotional problems. And one was a first grader and one was a fifth grader. And they were in classes with what I would consider to be good teachers for children without problems. But one of the things that I observed is that these teachers were very frustrated. But what bothered me most was that the children were often yelled at and sometimes hit because of their emotional problems. And I remember, I vividly remember a situation with the fifth grader, because the teacher was right across the hall from me. And the child was crying, and the teacher was, frustrated, and I didn't like the scene at all. And I remember saying to myself, there's got to be a better way. So when I continued my master's work, I realized that there was a possibility for me to go into a program that focused on children with what they called socially and emotionally disturbed. And the professor there offered me a traineeship. Actually, it was a 1-year fellowship, and I could go to school full-time and emerge with my master's degree. And I thought, that's wonderful. And so I did that, and I taught for a year or so in the Pittsburgh city schools. So I wanted to go into an urban setting, and that was different. It was totally different from my suburban experience. And even now, I pull upon those differences. I mean, they were dramatic differences. And I taught young children in an elementary school for a year, and then they asked me to supervise programs, which I did for a couple of years, but I still wanted to get my doctorate. So I applied to study full-time. I was going part-time at the university at that time, and I applied to study full-time, and I was accepted, and I came here to Ohio State and decided to study full-time. So, and then, you know, I had the opportunity to go back into the city schools and to work in supervision and administration. But I decided, I was real frustrated in the sense that I didn't feel like I was really making a difference. So I decided, let's try the university and let's see if I can get some answers and try to make an impact. And it's been a long haul, or some people say slog, but right now it's kind of interesting. Right now I'm doing some things that are not only challenging but exciting, and I hope, for me, in some real respects, are rewarding. Because I'm having the opportunity to work in urban schools with some of the children that I've been most concerned about, and to do research with my wonderful graduates, and to get some answers. It's one step at a time, and we're not going to change the world with the work but we are answering some of our questions, and we hope that in some small ways we'll get somebody to not only listen but to further the work that we've been doing.
That's nice. So you moved from trying to have direct action to having some grad students and being able to pursue more deeply some questions that you think are really authentic and necessary to explore. What are some of the questions?
Well, most recently, this is a biggie, so we're just trying to attack it a little piece at a time. But a big question is whether or not we can prevent special education referrals, some of the disciplinary referrals that disproportionately plague poor minority children. And you know, I readily acknowledge the fact that I'm a consumer of a lot of the work that other people have done. You know, I have not necessarily created models, but I have been very instrumental in trying to apply some of the ones that I believe in. And so, you know, a couple of things that we know about children and learning and special education and discipline is that all of that is intertwined. That, you know, sometimes we get into the chicken and the egg kind of thing, and I really don't have a need to get into trying to figure out which came first. I don't think we could. But there's no question in my mind that learning problems aggravate behavior problems, and that we can mitigate and certainly minimize some of the problems that children experience if we provide for early intervention, if we have a good plan, a good intervention. But if we intervene early, and if we are systematic, and if we're intensive about it and serious about it, there's no question in my mind we can make a difference.
Systematic, intensive, and individually relevant. Yeah?
Definitely. Now, one of the things that we've been doing is looking at early learning. Just to back up a little bit in terms of my career, when I started in special education, I remember clearly in the 70s we were getting referrals from teachers who were struggling with children who were 5, 6, 7 years of age. And we had a hard and fast rule that said children couldn't receive special education services until at least they were 8 years of age. And essentially, you know, it was a model that many people refer to as wait until they fail. Well, you know, we were sensitive to the whole notion of labeling children as having disabilities or handicaps. In those days we talked about handicaps. But labeling children prematurely, unnecessarily, unfairly, and so forth. And those were legitimate concerns. But the reality is, and what I'm absolutely convinced now, and I often say, that it was not so much waiting, not only did we wait until they fail, rigor mortis often sets in, and children just can't, they almost never catch up, even with the best efforts on the part of teachers and so forth. So we really need to intervene very early. And you know, there's some work that's being done by people at Vanderbilt, Lynn Fuchs and her husband, and as well as at is it University of North Carolina, I think, but I'm sorry, University of Kansas. And essentially, what they talk about the resistance to intervention, and the whole notion is that we would intervene early, provide good instructional interventions for these children, and look at those who are resistant to that intervention, and those who fail to respond to it. You know, they talk about primary and secondary and tertiary interventions. So primary intervention is that everybody gets good instruction. Secondary intervention is that, you know, we pull children out in small groups and provide that intensive instruction. And that, to a large extent, is what my students and I have been doing. And then there's the tertiary intervention, which some people might say is special education, and other people might say that's more intensive instruction. But essentially, what we're trying to do is, instead of waiting until youngsters fail, that we're trying to get them at the kindergarten level, and, you know, ideally at preschool, and to provide good instructional approaches with these children. I often, and this is, you know, just something I often talk about, it's not based on scientific research, but I talk about the plasticity of the brain, and I make the analogy to learning a foreign language. And I don't want to make any assumptions, but my feeling is that if we had a 5 or 6 year old who was immersed in a, let's say, a Spanish-speaking or a French-speaking environment, that child would learn that language a lot faster than either one of us, and certainly would learn those other languages without an accent, if they are learning this at the, prior to puberty. And that's because they're so adaptable. You know, people talk about the fact that when we're born, we have the capacity to utter all kinds of sounds. And, you know, if I were in a Spanish-speaking environment from birth, I would be able to trill my R's, which I can't do now, learning Spanish after I'm an adult. So the same analogy, I think, applies when we're working with very young children, children who we say haven't learned to break the code. And so, you know, the approach that we have been using is one that has received a great deal of attention in recent years, and that is phonemic awareness and phonological awareness and that sort of thing. And some of our preliminary research is very encouraging. Last year we we were only in one school, and we looked at, we pulled out the children who are identified as being at great risk in kindergarten. And now, even though I've been sort of knocking on the door for a long time in this school and other schools, this was one of the first times that I had the opportunity to get into kindergarten. And that's one of our problems that, well, I want to interrupt myself and say that I'm not, disparaging anyone, but we're all products of our training and that sort of thing. And very often, kindergarten teachers have this sense that their classrooms are sacred. Nothing should be done with these kids that is in any form an intervention, that we should use only what they call developmentally appropriate practices. Well, that's all well and good, but the problem is that the children that we're concerned about are children who come to school already behind. Farkas, who's a researcher out of the University of Penn State University, he makes the point. Now, here he's talking mainly about African American children, and he says they come to school at the level of kindergarten 1 year behind their more affluent peers, but by the time they get to 12th grade, they are 4 years behind their peers. And of course, many of them never even make it to 12th grade, and many of those who do are still not at the level that you expect a high school graduate. So recognizing that a lot of these youngsters have not had the preschool and the literacy experiences that they need in order to be successful, we really can't afford the luxury of waiting until they're in first grade even. We really have to intervene early. So at any rate, last year there was only one school, and we only worked with, we identified 8 children, I think we had, and we used what we called a single subject design. But the nice thing about that single subject design was that we were able to monitor each child's progress on a day-by-day, weekly basis. We can see where the youngsters were making gains and where they weren't. And unfortunately, we didn't get started with the youngsters until January. And actually, it's on one hand, it's unfortunate, but on the other hand, in terms of research, in a way it was fortunate, because we were able to monitor the youngsters for the first 3 or 4 months of school. And we could see that while the more capable students, for whatever reason, were making progress, this subset, and actually 1/3 of the class, was just stuck. They weren't moving at all. And so, or 1 or 2 of them were moving just a little bit, but it was very clear to us that if they stayed at this trajectory, that they would not be on grade level at the end of kindergarten. As a matter of fact, most of the kids were just what we call flatlined. The baseline was just, they were dead. So my doc student worked with the students on a daily basis. No, actually 3 times a week. We wanted to be able to do this 5 times a week, but we couldn't do it. They had something else going on. And so they, she worked with them 3 times a week for nearly 30 minutes each day. And what we saw, it was kind of interesting looking at the progress that the children, when we finished at the end of the year, we had 7 children. So we lost 1, 1 youngster moved out. And so out of the 7 children, 4 of them mastered all of the skills that we expected. They were what we called benchmark. And out of those 4, we had one youngster who was just phenomenal. He was you know, at baseline, at 0 from the very beginning. But then it was almost like somebody turned on a light. I mean, he only needed that little bit of prodding, and he just took off. As a matter of fact, he went so fast that we couldn't even keep him in a group. We had to teach him on a one-on-one basis because he was way beyond anybody else in the group. And we were so pleased about that. The other 3 children made really good progress. I mean, they were at, and with them as well, it was like, they got that aha experience. Oh, this is what they're talking about, you know. And so they were able to do well. A 5th youngster, he made good progress, but he wasn't at benchmark at the end of the year. Now, he was also phenomenal because at the beginning of the year, I was in the classroom observing him, and I'm pretty optimistic about children, but I was looking at this little kid, and he was just crawling around on the floor, crawling around the easels. He was not listening to anybody, and I'm thinking, oh boy, you know, I'm not really sure if we can rescue this little kid. But he made very good progress. His parents put him in summer school, and at the beginning of this year, we were pleasantly surprised to see that he was on grade level, and he's, you know, we're continuing to work with him. And 2 of the youngsters made very modest progress. One of those 2, I think if we can continue to work with him on an intensive basis, we'll be able to get him to where he should be. The last youngster, again, progress with him, but his rate of progress is at the point which makes me know that he'll need specialized instruction probably for the rest of his formal schooling. So at any rate, this is a school where it's very common to have 20, 30, even 40% of its students in special education. And in this year, the teacher had a good curriculum. She was doing a good job with those youngsters who were fairly easy to teach. Those youngsters who, for whatever reason, were sort of stuck, responded well to the intensive curriculum. Now, if we continue with that pattern in this school, you would have less than 5% of the youngsters falling within special education. And the idea is to make it even smaller than that. So I firmly believe that if we could get that kind of movement and production in our schools, particularly in our urban schools, we would greatly reduce the number of children who need specialized intervention, either for learning or behavior problems. The other thing is that we, in the same classroom during this year, during that past year, we also did some behavioral interventions and got the youngsters' problem behaviors way down. The way we did it was working with the teacher and helping the teacher to change the way she interacted with the children. So it's not the easiest thing to do, by the way. But these youngsters are all in general ed right now, and we're not having major behavior problems with them, and so that's encouraging.
That's great. That's a great story. Good work. Very good work. And I found it interesting that you talked about reducing from about 40% down to about 5%, which happens to coincide with that part of the spectrum of people who are having learning difficulty that we attribute to having some kind of neurobiological origin rather than having learning difficulty that you might say has been acquired in the context of their learning environment.
Right. Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's an issue that is discussed and some people would say is debated in the special education reading circles. And there's some authorities, and I tend to agree with this, that say that, you know, I believe that there is a segment of the population that, you know, for I'm not an authority on the brain studies, but that do have neurological problems that affect their ability to learn. And not to say they can't learn, it does mean that they need more intensive and specialized instruction. But that's a very small percentage, I believe, of all the youngsters that we're working with. A lot of the children that we're working with have been recipients of either no instruction or inappropriate instruction, or inadequate instruction.
Or it would seem to me that apart from instruction, we're talking about learning trajectories that begin at birth. I mean, Patricia Kuhl and others are talking about, you know, how a distinct mother eases affects the listening that's pulling language circuitry up in the brain at 9 months old.
Right.
So we're talking about this whole learning trajectory that's been going on for years before they ever show up in school.
That's right.
That school has to assess, meet, and differentiate in relationship to, rather than just instruct at.
Right. Well, yes, and I think absolutely. I mean, there have been wonderful studies. Again, I'm not that well versed on all of them, but I look at some of the work, just basic work that's been done at the A.B. Sedarian project in North Carolina and Alabama and so forth, and where they, the attractive thing about the work that they've done is that they start working with infants, and they have staff that work with infants, but also they have they teach parents how to work with their children. And I don't like the word work, but it is teaching. I mean, it's helping. It's
an orientation. Yeah?
Right.
How does parents become oriented to recognizing that their fundamentally most important role is perhaps stewarding the health and learning of this child?
Exactly. And the you know, just bombarding that child with language and nurturing that child's brain.
I assume you're familiar with Risley's work and all of that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right. And we've been down this corridor. We've talked to Risley. You mentioned George Farkas.
Yes.
I spent probably 4 hours on the phone with him and a 2-hour shoot at his house. And so we've been following the circuitry of all of this.
Right.
And it's really, really amazing when you look at how far a lot of parents and educators are away from understanding that this is a life developmental trajectory issue.
Exactly.
That if we don't see it, we're pushing our models on it, and it's like trying to change the trajectory of a meteor that's too late coming in.
Well, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree with you more. That's one reason why I think it's so important to have good preschool programs, and a lot of children don't have those. And it would be wonderful if we had good programs from birth. Children who are considered to be at the highest risk.
Which, in a way, though, the difficulty is there's a certain institutional limitation, how far you can reach with limits. I mean, it's ultimately, it seems like the kind of work that you're doing and some of the other people that we're talking to, it needs to translate into something that reaches through to connect to the parents themselves, so that it doesn't become some knowledge prescriptive list of things they're doing, but it shifts their orientation in relationship in a way that creates this learning, nurturing field around children.
Right, and we, professionals, we have to see that as part of our mission to communicate to parents along those lines. Unfortunately, we don't do a good job of investing in that kind of communication with parents. I mean, it's so often the emphasis on parents is, just to point out how inadequate they are, and as opposed to, being helpful to parents.
Yeah, yeah, and that just perpetuates the shame, which
Exactly.
when we could come to at another level is the big learning disability underneath the hood here, in that it's not the parent's fault, it's not the child's fault, it's nobody's fault. But these children born today, they have a date with destiny, with an artificially confusing artifact called learning to read.
Right, exactly.
And it's not about what would work in a natural environment that didn't have that challenge in it. It's about what you got to do that's almost unnatural in the family world environment to prepare children to not get hurt by that challenge.
Right. Well, where do we start? When I look at, first of all, when I look at what we do at the university and what we expect of teachers and educators and that sort of thing, very little emphasis is placed on intervention as it relates to families and parents and home-based learning. And so therefore, except for in special education, we do have a course on working with parents or something of that sort. And that's because of the legislation that says, parents are supposed to sign IEPs and to be part of the developers of IEPs and that sort of thing. But there's very little emphasis in the world of education at all about, how do we impact families, how do we help families truly facilitate the learning of their children, and how do we interact with families in the most appropriate way.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time actually trying to close my ears to some of the things that you hear, because we blame or bash parents to the point that they don't even want to hear what we have to say.
This is like I said, this thing about the shame. I want to get to that. I want to talk about that in terms of how enormously learning disabling the triggering of the affective shame is on learning itself generally. But when we talk about parents, rewind to what you were saying earlier about windows of plasticity, right? Or as Sean Koff and others on the early neuroscience work would say, look, there are sensitive windows. They're not critical windows in the sense of if you don't learn to walk, if you don't learn to listen, or your ears don't function at a certain stage, that can have lifelong critical threshold. But they're sensitive windows of development. And we know that the infrastructure of language processing from vocabulary development, which is what's undergirding phonemic awareness differentiation, is starting to really take off 2.5 years old, 3 years old. Right? If the environment that they're in at that time is inadequate, then they're not developing sufficiently to be ready for the challenge that lies ahead of them.
Right. Yeah, there's no question about that. And for example, we do have Head Start programs. And in terms of investment, for example, I remember years ago when Head Start first started that they would hire licensed teachers and provide some training. I don't think the training that we got at that time was what we really needed. If I were training teachers today, in Head Start, I'd be training them in totally different ways.
Sarah Green once said to us that there was a point at which they believed as an organization in what you were saying about kindergartners, developmentally appropriate. It's developmentally inappropriate to try to teach these kids stuff. And they've only in the past few years woke up to the fact that they must.
Well, that's true. And but in terms of, and so what has happened, and I want to mention something about that too, is that we sort of have not placed the emphasis on the qualifications these teachers. Now, this is not to bash them at all, but they very often have not had any kind of training in terms of teaching these basic skills that children need. And so sometimes it's only glorified babysitting as opposed to helping children to develop these critical skills. And then on top of that, we have a lot of people who feel very, very strongly at the university level that you should not teach these skills to children. And
I totally sympathy with the sense that it's unnatural to do that, right? But so's going to school, and so's hitting the wall and reading.
Yeah.
Those are, I mean, that's the most artificial, technological.
Well, you know, people will say it's unnatural to do that, but what makes it unnatural if kid A comes to school with all of these skills and kid B doesn't come to school with all of these skills? Kid A is ready to learn and he'll benefit from everything the teacher has to provide. Kid B doesn't have these skills. He would have been better off if somebody had helped him with them when he was 2.5 or 3 years of age. So what's wrong with my capturing this kid when he's 2.5, 3, and 4 years of age and helping him to develop what he's going to need when he is 5 and 6 years of age?
I completely agree with you, but that refers to the fact that if you were looking at this from a point of view of the development of the human organism without concern for its future challenges and tribulations going through the artificial in particular, then you could say, well, this is what's developmentally appropriate for the unfolding of this human being. But we also have to say, given the way society is, given the way our systems function, the fact that we do have these things called public schools, that we are going to push reading at kids at a particular age, then that's what necessitates us helping them so they don't get hurt by that.
Right.
Yeah. I want to talk about the National Association for the Education of African Americans with Learning Disabilities.
Right.
And then I want to tease out a little bit more of this conversation that we've just kind of touched on, having to do with this difference. I mean, even here in the National Association for the Education of African Americans with Learning Disabilities, there's this big raging debate going on out there. It's primarily political, not scientific, that wants to constrain the definition of a learning disability in a way that reduces how many children we're able to help.
Right.
For political, economic reasons.
For economic reasons, yes.
Not because that's really, I mean, a child who learns to become learning averse for emotional reasons, given the overwhelm that they're experiencing, they are as learning harmed as somebody who had a neurobiological, structural, genetic trajectory issue. Even though this thing's been caused by our adult negligence, not a neurobiological genetic issue.
That's true. And I personally, I don't have a great deal of sympathy for anybody who wants to limit the numbers based on economic factors. See, my position is, well, my focus right now is on prevention in the interest of children, not in the interest of money or, the government or what have you.
But even prevention implies, does it not, that it's being acquired rather than it's innate?
Well, yes, and you're right, and I think that to some extent it is acquired. Well, let me say this, that there's some people who are natural dancers. I'm not one of them. Others of us can learn to dance if we're taught. I mean, as you can imagine, I have relatives who can look at a step once and they've got it. You've got to talk me through it a couple of times before, but it doesn't mean that I can't dance. There are some people who, for whatever reason, are just so uncoordinated that even talking them through, it's going to, they'll need specialized instruction to get through. There are different levels of that. If I never got any instruction where you sort of helped me move through those steps, I would never be able to, I shouldn't say I would never be, it would be painfully hard, and I'd probably never be able to dance, simply because getting out on the dance floor would be so embarrassing for me, I'd never do it. So part of what I'm saying is that there are children who need to be ushered through the steps. I mean, who are not easy learners, who, for whatever reason, need more input in order to get that aha experience, in order to be more effective learners. But if they don't get that input, these youngsters could very easily become deficient to the point that they display a significant disability. And those youngsters need to be served. But if we can work with them early on and help them to develop those skills, we can either eliminate or minimize the amount of service, and those youngsters are going to be so much better off, because my observation is that for those youngsters who don't get that assistance, even though we provide support for them later on, they are never as well off as if they get that assistance earlier on. So, I'm just, and then for the population that I'm most concerned about, there's so many other factors that are involved. Schooling. For example, if I happen to be a kid who needs assistance, and my parents happen to be fairly affluent, and they can either put me in very good schools or put me in private schools to help make up for this. Or if I've got a mother who's a stay-at-home mother who can spend hours with me at night helping me to develop these skills, then I'm going to be so much better off than that kid who happens to be in a school that doesn't have resources, where the teacher may just assume that he's not going to do very well anyway, that, I've got a mother who's working 2 jobs, and, and I don't have any support at home. That kid's going to, you can imagine what's going to happen to him. He's going to fall further and further behind. So we want to empower children by giving them some skills that, even if all of these other things are operating for them, they'll be able to sort of move along on their own.
Yeah, great. I want to come back to something that you said about dancing, which seems to me to be universally relevant, which was that one of the reasons you wouldn't be able to dance as well is that you'd be embarrassed to get out there on the floor. Yeah. And that ultimately, when you look at people in so many different modes that are performing in public with whatever it is they're doing, you've got a narrow window to get successful before how you feel about performance becomes learning disabling.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true, but the other thing, this thing sort of feeds itself, though. If I have a halfway decent experience in dancing, and you're right, and then I feel fairly comfortable, then I'm going to be willing to get back out on the floor, and I'll dance a little bit more, and the more I dance, the better I get. I mean, it's just like anything else.
Matthew effects.
Yes, that's right. Lots of practice. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? But if I have a negative experience, and people laugh at me, and I'll tell you, in my community, they'd laugh at me, I would not get back out there, and I wouldn't practice it anymore. And and so I get less and less coordinated and that sort of thing. And we see that with children too. We see that with them learning to read. They've got to have some success. That's why I keep emphasizing working with the youngsters when they're very young. Because first of all, it's before they have developed a sense about being terribly embarrassed if they can't do it. you're likely to get them to do it, to keep trying. And the more that they practice, which is one of the things that we fight against in working with some people in the schools, they think that high levels of practice are counterproductive, and I think just the opposite, you know. So, you know, I hope I'm sort of touching on what
you are, and that's good. I appreciate you kind of pausing here to check in with me. Just as reading itself is a faster than conscious assembly, right? I mean,
yes.
There's a part of the brain that has to perform this artificial and otherwise unnatural assembly of a virtual reality, a simulation of language in the brain.
Right.
Right? According to a code.
Right.
According to a set of technological instructions.
Right, which is man-made.
Which is man-made. And this particular code is a mess. It's only a few hundred years old.
Right.
So if kids don't have all the foundational language processing, the speed of processing, the phonemic awareness differentiation that came with having a rich vocabulary, then when they hit this artificial, confusing situation, their brains stutter. You can hear it in their articulation. If this happens for too long, they become self-conscious of it.
Right.
They become self-conscious of it. They've entered a downward negative spiral.
Right.
Right? This is the core of our story, because what happens to children who develop a pre-conscious shame aversion to the feeling of confusion?
Right. You know, that's a wonderful question. Couldn't even come close to coming up with an answer. I would love to know whether people have done any research that sort of looks at if they could even try to codify when that particular experience happens. I mean, for example, developmentally, is there a point at which that happens with most children? I mean, as you use the term brain stutters. Is
Processing stutters, yes.
Yes. Is there a point that we can identify when that happens with most children, or when they become so traumatized or embarrassed by the process that psychologically they give up?
It's the same thing you were talking about with dancing. I mean, if you think about your own life, you think anybody you know, we're constantly walking around with our radar screens trying to avoid the things that trigger shame in us.
Yes, right.
Right? What happens when learning itself is something we're ashamed of? What happens to our life?
Right. Well, and the thing that is also, I personally think that there's a gender difference in that whole business of when learning triggers shame, or the failure to learn triggers shame. Now, again, I have no way of proving that and haven't done any research on that, but one of the things that we do know is that there seems to be a gender difference in learning. When I look at, now this year is the exception in one school, but when we are looking in kindergarten, for example, I'm looking for those kids that are presenting the most difficulty in terms of learning, learning to break the code.
Okay. So say learning in general, learning in particular to the code.
Yes, learning to break the code.
Okay.
We find more boys than girls, especially at that early stage. Now, this year we identified more girls than we've ever identified, but usually it's boys. And now the other thing is, when do they reach the point where they've turned it off, when they assume that this is not going to happen for them, and they begin to try to esteem themselves in other ways? I'm not absolutely certain, but I get the feeling that happens very early on, probably by the time they're 8 years of age. They have just dropped out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's happening much before then.
Probably.
It's idiosyncratic to them.
Yeah.
It has to do with their tolerance for emotional self-negativity. It has to do with their confusion, frustration tolerance with respect to what their mind's occupied in doing,
Right.
and how those things are automatically scripting with one another to punctuate and stutter up how well they're able to process.
Yeah, right.
And that this is happening has more to do with their trajectory than their neurological inheritance, and that this is happening, in kindergarten. Preschool, kindergarten.
There's no question that
Yeah.
it is happening. I'm just wondering, when is it that they have stopped? Absolutely. For example, one of the little boys that we worked with, when he was in first grade, we interviewed him. And this was a kid who was presenting some behavior problems. I don't know how significant they were. I do know teachers were complaining about it. And he was also at the bottom of the class in terms of reading. And a surprising thing, this was a little exercise that the teachers were asked to do. They were asked to interview the children. And this little boy, despite the fact that people complained a great deal about him, he said that there were two things that he wanted. One was he wanted to learn to read. I mean, he had sort of defined himself by the ability to read. And the other was he wanted kids to like him a little bit more. And those were the two areas he was having the greatest difficulty. We decided to take him on as a special project and worked with him in his reading. He is very close to grade level right now, even though when we were working with him, he's now in 5th grade. When we first started working with him, the teacher said she didn't think he would ever get on grade level. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this, I'm not attributing any great miracle work to us, but at first grade, reading was very, very important to this kid. I speculate that reading is still very important to a lot of these youngsters. This is an inner city kid. But I also firmly believe that if we hadn't worked with him and shown him that he was making progress, we sort of set up these goals and we work with him 3 or 4 times a week, that he would achieve his goals, that he probably would have tuned out. Maybe in another year or so, if he saw himself still at the bottom of the class and that sort of thing. He's now easily at the middle of the class.
A number of little kids that we talk to, it's amazing. Once they get to this point that you were kind of stretching for a little while ago, what we call shame out.
Right.
Once they get to that point, they begin the process of saying, "Oh, reading's stupid. Who needs it anyway?"
Exactly.
Or I'm stupid. I'm just not a reader. I'm just not a smart person.
Exactly.
They come up with various types of self-talk definitions that alleviate the pain of the shame that would go with continuing to consider it to be important.
Right. And on the other hand, though, I see little girls, they'll keep struggling with it. I mean, even if they're not good readers, they'll keep struggling with it much longer than boys will. And that's not based on research, it's just based on my personal
But it also
observation.
makes sense. I mean, again, when we talk about how it's like launching a space shuttle, right? There's this window, and it depends on where you're launching from. It depends on all these variables. But ultimately, emotional frustration tolerance.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why my work, I tried to target minority, particularly African American, but all minority males. 10 years ago, though, here in Columbus, minority kids were mainly African American. Now we have Somalians and Hispanics and even Vietnamese. We've got that combination in our intervention group. But if Hispanic and African American males are definitely at the bottom of the barrel when we look at academic achievement, but my observation is that our window of opportunity in working with those boys is much smaller, and so therefore that's one of the reasons why I want to get in at least in kindergarten, to work with them.
I completely agree with you. And interestingly, in some important ways, the family language, both vocabulary, patterns of use, the complexity, the intonations are very poorly represented in the speech, in the text they're supposed to learn to read with.
Well,
And the bigger the gap, that's contributing here.
Well, you're absolutely right. And by the way, when you're talking about families, Nancy Tidwell, who was the president and the person who initiated the National Association for the Education of African American Children with Learning Disabilities, she has just done a fabulous job. I mean, she's just a wonderful person and right on target, and she's tireless in her work and deserves very high praise. I often tell her that she's the answer to my prayers, because I just feel that it's so important to have to communicate with parents along these lines, and that's one vehicle for doing it, as well as having these parents to act as advocates for their children. Those of us in special education know that the prime mover for services for children with disabilities has always been parents. And if we hope to make an inroad relative to children, minority children, or you've got to have parents involved.
The interventions have little leverage the further from the developmentally critical trajectory establishing family learning environment as you go, right?
Yeah, right.
It's going to be harder and harder and harder. So
that's right. And so the family is really critical, and I, earlier I was saying that professionals often don't understand how to intervene as it relates to parents, and I'm not very optimistic that we're going to get a whole lot better at it. But I do feel that family organizations or family-oriented organizations such as this can play a major role in trying to reach parents and trying to get that kind of information out to parents.
Yeah, I think we all got to join together in saying it's important for us to collectively learn how to do this.
Right.
And that involved in collectively learning how to do this means collectively learning how to communicate with parents, not a recipe how to, but an on fire, inside them, alive orientation about how to participate so as to nourish the health of their child's learning.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Right. And by the way, I don't want you to leave here with the impression that my work has only been with minority children. Quite the contrary. My work is, I'm passionate about all children. I've worked in urban settings mainly because I have felt that there is the greatest need, and in special education, there's been this whole issue of disproportionality, and we've talked a lot about it, and we haven't done a lot in terms of intervention. I don't think so.
I agree with your point of focus. I mean, I've been doing work with the National Center for Family Literacy. We've been interviewing people all over the place, and we're trying to identify, how is it that we can help the people that need it the most, the kids that need it the most, and that's what kind of brings us here. So I appreciate your focus, and our mission isn't unique to any particular, subpopulation of children. It's the children generically, right?
Exactly, that's right. Yeah.
But the children that need it the most happen to be the ones whose life circumstance trajectory is insufficiently preparing them for the challenge of the world.
That's right, exactly. And then, all of the systems that impact these children, whether it's the home, the community, the school, which are the major systems that, for these children, all of those systems are not working at the maximum level,
Being kind.
well, it's one level of dysfunction to another.
Yeah, it's negligent and irresponsible.
There's some of that too.
Yeah. What's your role with the National Association for Education of African Americans with Learning Disabilities?
Well, I'm an advisor. I knew Nancy before we got the organization started. And she's, as I said, the prime mover there. And so I work very closely with them. I'm on the advisory board, and we meet periodically, and we just discuss what, you know, the directions of the organization, and try to give advice. Right now, for example, she is trying to do a survey of the parents of the constituency, and so I gave her some advice on how to
Design that.
design that, and it's on the web. And
Hope they get a whole bunch of parents to actually help, you know, evolve that.
yes, right, exactly. And then I hope to give her some, you know, to work with them as we analyze the data or something of that sort.
Good, good. Well, I'm happy. I'd like to have an open channel, so that in addition to the video jewels, which we've got some good ones covering, you know, a wide range of your work and orientation, but that I think we're going to want to do a supplement to this, which will be phone-based.